Then we get, after his speech, the 12 chapters that we've gone through over the last 12 weeks, to verse 8 of chapter 12. So turn with me back over to the end, page 478. Page 478. We get to verse 8, and we're reintroduced now to the narrative. If you notice, the teacher is now back in the third person. Kohelet's not speaking anymore. Kohelet has given us his speech, and now the host of the conference comes back up to give the final words, so to speak. He reminds us in 12:8 of Kohelet's main point and theme, meaningless, meaningless, or hevel, hevel, says the teacher, everything is hevel. And then he concludes the matter. What the NIV has as its heading, the conclusion of the matter, of all these experiences and observations. And last week we talked about how Kohelet ends his story. The I section ended last week. We talked about how he seems to resolve it, how he talks about this tension in his life between what he wants to believe about God, but what he sees happening in the world, and how those don't often go together. We saw how he sort of talks about that resolution. But now we get the narrator who sort of concludes over Kohelet's conclusion and talks about it a little bit more. He tells us a little bit more about Kohelet and the role of wisdom for the people of God. What role does wisdom play? So let's look at that. Verses 9 to 14. Let's read it. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads. They're collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one capital S, shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Amen. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty, or this is what it means to be human. This is the being of humanity. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So verses 9 to 10 tell us about Kohelet's words. That he searched to find just the right words to use in the book. And then the narrator puts his own stamp of approval on them, saying that what Kohelet writes is upright and true. We need to pay attention to what he's saying in this book. They're words of wisdom. And so if we think, as sort of a side note to what Kohelet means in the Hebrew, the gatherer, the one who gathers, we can see that there's maybe a play here, because he's one who gathers his thoughts. He gathers sayings and proverbs. That may give us one indication as to what Kohelet means, because the narrator tells us that in verses 9 and 10. That he pondered, he searched out, he set in order, he gathered many proverbs. He searched out just the right words. He was gathering up right words. And what he wrote was upright and true. You need to listen. And then verses 11 and 12 tell us what we already knew if we've been coming to the series this summer. That the words of the wisdom literature of the Scriptures, which is the books of Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Job in the Old Testament, are goads that poke us and prod us. Does anybody know what a goad is? Dean, tell us what a goad is.
Well, in the old days when you wanted to keep a horse or a mule or an ox going in the right direction, you put it on the side of it sharp pointed sticks, so that if the animal tried to turn it right or left, it would focus on the sticks.
Very good. Did everybody hear that? In the Old Testament, whenever you wanted an animal to, if you were plowing, you wanted them to go in a straight line, or anytime you wanted to go in a certain direction, you would put these goads on them, and they would poke you in the left or in the right, and they would force the animal, or they would strongly encourage the animal to go in the right direction. And that's how he is saying that these words and the words of wisdom act impact in the life of God's people. Before Peter, yes, that's true. I don't think that would be acceptable. But these words sort of awaken us from our dogmatic slumber. They make us uncomfortable. They say things about God and they say things about ourselves that we don't like to hear. But we have to listen. The point of verses 9 to 12 is to remind the readers to take the words of Kohelet seriously. We need to meditate on them. We need to see what they say about our lives. They need to be our goads. We need to allow them to goad us, to poke us, to prod us. Learn to live in these words. And then verses 13 to 14 is the book's proper closing. The narrator reminds us of Kohelet's conclusion. In 13 to 14, he basically says, Kohelet is right. Let me sum up what he ended with, what his conclusion was. Now all has been heard, he said. So here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty, or what it means to be human. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And if you remember from last week, this is basically where Kohelet ends up, although he doesn't say it so clearly. We have to remember why he's saying this. This is not what he's been saying throughout the book. He's been saying, how can we even know if God will judge? How do we even know if people go to heaven or hell or what happens when they die? We can't observe any of that. We see a dead body and that's what all we see. How can we even know whether they rise up to be with the other spirits or be with God, or whether they go down to be with the souls of the animals? How can we know that? But last week we learned this progression that's been happening in Kohelet, where what he's saying here and what the narrator is saying is a faith statement. We can't prove this. There's no evidence that shows us. We don't see God judging people after they die, all of their accomplishments, every deed. But this is the conclusion of the matter. And I hesitate to even give the conclusion for the people who haven't been with us in this series, because this series was aptly titled The Journey Through Ecclesiastes. The book has been about the journey. It's not about the conclusion. It's about experiencing the harsh realities of life and experience this hevel. To the place where we cannot anymore naively or arrogantly or passively say, oh, just fear God and keep his commandments and everything will be great. We can't rip these verses out of context without the rest of the struggle and the pain and the observations and the experiences that Kohelet's gone through in the other 11 chapters. These verses mean a lot more than just what they say. There's a lot of story behind it. It's more like through fighting tears and anger about how broken the world is, with our fist in the air, we still lift our heads and say, I don't know what's going on. I know it doesn't look like there's much going on in the world right now, that God is really involved, but I still believe. That's more where this conclusion comes in, is in that, but I still believe.